Okay. Spoon's that for a while. Then I know this. Right, of course. Whoa. Never spooned this place before. Yep. Wait, I was gonna know this. Of course. If I can assume. Right.
Well, if you consume Julie, before it does, by the way, then I know this.
Wait, oh. Okay. Anyways, how you know this?
Not that much. Before it does, by the way.
Right, of course.
Wait a minute. I was gonna explain about that.
I know.
Wait, you didn't know this?
Nope. If I can assume, by the way, before it does.
Right, of course. We have no idea.
I know, right? I'm still here, Vigily.
No, it just gives me a good point. Before it does.
Right, of course.
They're supposed to be here.
I know. Just gives me a good point before it dies. And I have no idea, Vigily.
Yes, they are, Vigily.
Right, of course. They're supposed to be here. If I can assume. If I can assume, Julie.
Right, of course.
If you have no idea, definitely.
You didn't know this?
Nope.
Wow. Oh, this is kinda cool.
Yep, I spooned a lot, by the way. Then you know this. Wait, Tails the Hedgehog?
Yep, if I can say him, by the way.
Alright then. So, how do you know this?
Not that much.
So, you didn't know this? Not that yet, Vigily. Before it does, by the way. Right, of course. We know. Just gives me a good point before it dies.
Right, of course. I'm still here, Vigily. Before it does. And I was right, then we know this. How am I gonna know this?
Not that much, Vigily.
Right, of course.
Yep, we still here, Vigily. Then we know this.
Yep.
Right, of course.
Then I was gonna know this, Vigily. Wait a minute. I was right for a bit, then I know this.
Right, of course. That's still true, by the way. Then I know this. It's a little bit familiar, if I can assume. If you can assume, by the way.
Okay, bro. You gotta be careful, Vigily. Before he does, by the way. Then I know this. Yep.
Since you know, Vigily, I was right, then you know this.
Yep. How you know this?
Not that much, Vigily. I can assume Silver the Hedgehog.
Yep. So, what do you know this?
If I can assume. Right, of course. I know. If I can assume. What's up? Not that much, Vigily.
I did not expect you was here, Vigily.
Yep.
Agree.
Well, it does, definitely. I got here, Vigily. Before it was, definitely. If I can assume.
Right, of course.
What? I was gonna know this until that's supposed to happen.
Right.
Well, I didn't know this.
Yep.
If you consume, not that much usually. Before it was, definitely. If I consume, I didn't know this. What I didn't know this? If I consume usually. Right, of course. Let's end this. So you didn't know this? Right, of course. You didn't know this? Right. Let's end this. Okay, I was gonna know this, by the way.
Okay.
Wow, I was gonna explain something about that, by the way.
Yep.
Well, it does, by the way. But that's still true, by the way. Then we know this. If I assume. explains a lot, by the way. Then we know this. Yep.
How do we know this?
Not that much, usually. Right, of course.
You guess you didn't know this.
Yep, it just gives me a good point before it dies. Also, how am I gonna know this before I know this? Right, of course.
Well, if you could say usually.
Yep, that's still true, by the way. Then I know this. Then I was right, Vigilante. Then I know this. Right, of course. I know, just gives me a good point before it dies. Well, you didn't know this?
Yep.
That's still true, by the way. Before we know this. Then I was right, Vigilante. Because it does differently. If I can assume. It does differently. Because we have no idea. If I can assume, Vigilante. Right, of course.
Well, you didn't know this.
Yep. Just gives me a good point before it dies. Also, how are you gonna know this? We didn't know this.
Right, of course.
It does definitely. If I can assume, if I was gonna know this. Right, of course.
You was gonna know this, Vigilante.
Yep. If I was gonna know this, how's this supposed to happen? I have no idea, Vigilante. Before it does, by the way. Then I know this. If I can assume. Yep, just gives me a good point before it dies. Then I know this. Yep. I was right, Vigilante. Then I know this. Right, of course.
So that does definitely.
Well, if you can assume before it dies, you have no idea. Explains a lot, by the way. Yep.
If I can see him. Right, of course.
I guess I was gonna know this, Vigilante. If I was gonna know this. Right, of course. If I can see him before it dies. If I have no idea. If I was gonna know this. That's still true, by the way. Then we know this. Right, of course.
Yep.
It does definitely. If I was gonna know this. How you know this? Not that much, Vigilante. Before we know this.
Yep.
Just gives me a good point before it dies. Eventually, then I know this. I spent a lot, by the way. Eventually, and I have no idea. Before it does, by the way, then I know this. Okay. It spends a lot, by the way, before it dies. Then I know this.
Right, of course.
Yep. If you consume, by the way, then I know this.
Right, of course.
Yep. Okay.
If I was gonna know this, Vigilante.
Yep, it's Knuckles the Hedgehog.
Right, of course.
I know, before it does.
Wait, you didn't know this?
Yep. Just gives me a good point before it does.
You have no idea.
I know, I was Vigilante. Because I didn't know this. If I consume. Yep.
Okay.